Do you want your business to grow faster? Are you open to new and out-of-the-box ways to drive revenues and increase value? How do you imagine the most successful entrepreneurs and business leaders double, triple, or expand their businesses tenfold or more? The answer is Deals. This is a weekly podcast featuring conversations with business owners, executives, and leaders as we reveal behind-the-scenes details that give you, our listeners, the confidence to pursue your own deal-driven growth. On this show, we discuss a huge variety of deals, everything from large, complex mergers and acquisitions, capital raising, joint ventures, strategic alliances, real estate, affiliate and sponsorship deals, franchising, and more. My name is Corey Kupfer, and I've been supporting deal-driven growth for businesses for over 35 years as a successful entrepreneur, professional negotiator, and attorney. My goal is to help you strategize, plan for, find, and complete deals that will help your company grow faster. Welcome to the DealQuest Podcast. Let's get started. Stephanie Pimentel is the founder and CEO of Lumena Global Advisory, a boutique firm specializing in Latin American market entry, cross-border workforce strategy, and expansion risk management. With an executive background in multinational operations and human capital leadership, she has advised U.S. companies, private equity groups, and growth stage founders on structuring compliant, scalable operations across Mexico, Colombia, Brazil, and beyond. Her work focuses on preventing costly regulatory, payroll, and workforce missteps before and after transactions. Stephanie is known for bridging deal strategy with operational reality. She helps buyers assess workforce liabilities during diligence, restructure post-acquisition teams, and design compliant cross-border infrastructure that protects enterprise value. She's a Dominican-American executive with degrees in human resource management, forensic psychology, and she combines the behavioral insight, compliance strategy, and lived international experience to guide responsible global growth. Stephanie, welcome to the DealQuest Podcast.
Wow, that was an amazing intro.
Well, I love it. I mean, I wanted to do the full intro because I wanted to show like all the things you bring to the table. I mean, there's so much involved in international deals and dealing with cross-cultural and cross-border transactions. And a lot of people make mistakes that way. And, it's not just the knowledge and skills. It's also cultural. It's also interpersonal. So I'm excited that you have this background. I want to get into all of that and how you help companies do that. Before we go there, I want to take you back to when you were maybe 8, 10, 12 years old, when you were a little girl. What did you want to be? Because I'm guessing cross-border transactional expert was not it back then, but you tell me.
You imagine an 8-year-old saying, "Hey, I want to do cross-border expertise, Mom."
Right.
No, I think growing up, I wanted to be a singer, a dancer. I wanted to be famous. I think we all go through those phases when we're that age. But reality hit, and it hit hard. I was growing up in the Bronx, where women like me didn't have opportunities to be in leadership roles, or we feared what it would be like. So we stuck to whatever was safe just to get the bills paid.
Got it. Well, obviously, you've evolved a lot from there, and I want to hear more about that journey. But one other thing looking back, though, what was your first deal of any type that you were involved in? Was it when you got into doing what you do now, or were there earlier experiences in terms of deal making?
I mean, I think the trajectory led me this way, right? Because I started in HR as a coordinator at $11.75 the hour in New York. I tried to get into those tables really early in my career. And I think I started with helping with recruiting and meeting those recruiting numbers and getting those recruiting referrals, things that you would not think would lead you that way. But that's where I started. I started just seeing those referral bonuses coming into my check. And I was like, okay, I like this.
Love it. Love it. So then when did it evolve? Well, give us a little bit, more about your journey. So how did it evolve to including working with companies that are, doing transactions across borders?
I mean, I started in telecommunications. I've been in every single industry you could possibly imagine. From there, I went into logistics, and that was my first experience building an operation from scratch from an HR perspective. And it was over the road. So I was doing deals interstate. And interstate dealt with dealing with the ports, and then the port dealt with crossing the border. And that's where I started.
Wow.
Mhm.
Love that. So listen, let's talk about this, right? Because we do international deals for clients where we have good connections with, attorneys in various other parts of the world, whether that's through our Entrepreneurs Organization Network, or through an organization, International Lawyers Organization, that my partner's involved in. And obviously, we see it from a legal point of view. But I mean, there's so much that can go wrong with any kind of deal. And then certainly when you talk about crossing borders, and especially if it's in a place where you've never been or never lived or don't have experience. So talk to us about, some of the things that come up in these kind of deals, and the different, you have experience across several different countries, at least, and some of the differences in terms of the ways folks do business in these various places.
Well, as you mentioned, I work on the part of the deals most people ignore until it becomes very expensive. Post-acquisition, work structures, compliance, and operational realities across borders, especially in Latin America, are completely different. If you categorize Latin America as one whole, that's where most companies mess up.
Yeah.
There are legal structures very different in Mexico from hiring to what it would look like in Brazil or in Chile or in Argentina, as well as the workforce culture. And I think I've curated 17 years worth of relationships in these countries where I sat down and met these people and I had dinner with the CEO as well as sat at lunchtime with the janitor. Like I've been through these experiences and I know exactly what it is, what to translate their work culture to the US. And people have to, or companies, I guess, have to be more careful of what they do post-acquisition or pre-acquisition. I would say that, so your capital deploys exceptionally well. You want to make sure that you investigate exactly how that workforce structure is, how the compliance is, how the operational realities of every day are in each country.
Yeah.
So I help buyers, operators, advisors understand how people, payroll, and legal structure can either protect the deal or destroy it completely after close.
So let's talk, obviously, without any names or anything confidential, but give us some examples about where companies make mistakes in these various, countries, a little more specifics around these categories that you mentioned, where people mess up.
No names, but I had a U.S. company acquired a majority stake in an overseas company. They believed it was profitable based on the historical financials, and after close, it became quite clear that the operation was bleeding cash and the workforce systems were misaligned completely. Wow. So I was brought in to rebuild from an HR and operations standpoint and restructure the roles, stabilize payroll, support revenue growth by fixing that human system that were holding performance back. So I went in, did an audit, and I was able to see where those cracks in the operation were to generate revenue after the deal was closed, because in that specific country, there was no take backsies, you would say. My 8-year-old self was talking, right? It was memorable to me because it showed how easily deals miss the reality, how it's still not impossible to fix once the deal's closed.
Yeah. So, so you said something really important there, right? Like the historical financials didn't show this, right? And obviously, I'm sure, it sounds like it was a big enough deal where they had lawyers and accountants and, all the maybe investment bankers and brokers, whatever. They had all the professionals involved. And yeah, you do all this paper due diligence, right? And, and you hope that things show up on the, on the P&L. What is it? Well, first of all, what is it that was missed, and what kind of, let's try to be proactive, obviously, because listen, it's one thing, it's great that you can come in and save them, right, and clean it up after the fact, but what should they have done on due diligence to try to get ahead of this? That, again, we're not naming names, but what should companies have done or do in those scenarios to understand that better pre-close?
I mean, what the problem is, Corey? There's no really standard governance when you're expanding to Latin America, and that's what I'm creating now.
Yeah.
Because I have 5 pillars that I measure against every deal, and I do due diligence on each pillar, asking many questions. I have a 40 set of questions that either have a disqualifying event or don't, and at the end, I grade them, and I'm able to see where those cracks are, and we're able to either fix those cracks before the deal closes, or back away from the deal before we sign. So what people fail to miss and companies fail to miss is the actual reporting, right? The reporting is not completely accurate. They're hiring these consultants in these countries, and they have their in-house team doing the due diligence, but they don't know exactly what they're looking for because they don't know what's exactly important in that country. Yeah. Until you sign the deal, that you see the legal complexities of it and you see the differences of business, and especially in the workforce systems, right? I've had For example, I had a company that was doing a deal in Brazil, and the workforce structure was misaligned, and they hired incorrectly. In each wrong hire, Brazil charged them $250,000 per
Ah.
per wrong hire. Yeah.
So when you say Brazil charged them 250, like, let me understand that. What do you mean they charge them? How does that work down there?
Well, Brazil has many things that you have to pay an employee, and it has to be set up prior to you hiring them, right?
Okay.
Things that we don't see here, like a lunch stipend.
Okay.
Then you get, those government fees once you hire incorrectly. And that's where that notification came in, like you mishired and you have this amount due per employee.
Wow. Wow. Yeah. I mean, I'm saying, wow, it's not like I'm not familiar with this. I mean, I've encountered this for various clients in various places, and it's why we always have to get local knowledge. Some folks, for example, in the U.S., like even if you talk about Europe, in a lot of places, I mean, the U.S. folks are mainly, I mean, there are some exceptions for anti-discrimination laws and things like that. But for the most part, the U.S. is an at-will employment situation, right? So he's not in a union and they haven't negotiated an employment contract that guarantees them anything, for the most part, you can get rid of him if you want to get rid of him, as long as it's not for discriminatory reasons, things like that. Whereas, I mean, I may know Europe a little better, but, I mean, various countries have mandatory severance. They have all kinds of other things that don't allow you to have the freedoms that employers think they have. So that sounds like it's another great example. So you mentioned these 6 pillars that you have, and in terms of your due diligence, you want to give us sort of a high level on what they are?
Well, I start with workforce governance, tax and regulation, financials, cultural fluency. So those are some of my pillars that I measure against when I'm helping a company expand to Latin America. Those are all categorized by 40 questions. I have a proprietary tool that I created to run them through my audit system and give them that clear expansion roadmap before capital deployment. So it goes by country selection, risk mapping, operating model design. That goes from workforce and talent architecture, operational infrastructure, and then I quantify that risk for you. I tell you whether you are ready to expand or what you have to fix on your end first before you even look at expansion. And if you're already ready for expansion, then I let you know what to expect in that country and what to look for.
Wow. Well, that sounds unbelievably valuable. I mean, so talk to me about the cultural piece, right? I mean, I feel like there was a time going decades back where people were a lot less sensitive to that. I feel like there's a lot of more, at least discussion and talk about awareness of cultural differences. People still make significant mistakes in that area, right? So talk to me a little bit about that, right? Because sure, you can have a consultant come in and explain to you things, or even you could do a great job. But then, these folks have to operate the business, and if they're from a different part of the world and they're ultimately running the show, what's the work that's really involved to become culturally aware and have it be successful?
Absolutely. So culture is not values on a wall, like most of us think on this end, right? Culture is how decisions get made when no one's watching. So when it comes to cross-border expansion, culture determines how authority is respected or challenged, how fast teams move, how leaders communicate, how conflict is handled, and whether compliance is followed or bypassed. When U.S. companies enter Latin America, they often assume operational systems will transfer clearly, and they don't, right? Cultural friction is one of the most things that happens as soon as while the ink is still wet on the paper. So they underestimate how much this costs the bottom dollar of your capital deployment.
Yeah. I've heard of some fascinating, like I remember I read about a thing years ago, and they've improved on this a lot apparently, but years ago with a lot of Asian airlines having higher issues with mechanical and even crashes because of the cultural deference that people would have, even the co-pilot to the pilot, right? And certain maintenance people to their managers, right? Where they might see something, but they were much less inclined to speak up. And they actually had to really work hard to shift that culture for safety purposes, right? To have somebody, U.S., you see something, say something. Like, again, I'm generalizing because the U.S. also has a lot of cultures within it, right? But, but in general, there's this thing where, okay, yeah, sure. If you see something wrong with the plane, let us know. So, do you have some other like examples in particular places where, whether it's how they relate to authority or how they take initiative or how they work in teams or whatever it is, where there are some, specific, cultural differences that you experience and observe?
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. I had a US leadership team, right? Here on the US side that values, like most of us, direct confrontation and flat hierarchy. But the local team in Brazil does not operate like that, right? And that's they like indirect communication. And these issues become very expensive because when you don't value that or you don't take into account that personality difference or that governance exposure, to workforce, you have a retention issue, productivity issue, compliance adherence. And then what happens is you create this turnover, and turnover is massively expensive in Latin America.
Yeah.
So you owe a lot when someone leaves. It doesn't matter how they left, right? That's the gist of it, to keep it simple. So that culture is the invisible operating system of the company. And if you expand without recalibrating or at least understanding before you go in to that local environment, you create a silent killer with that deal that you made. And it doesn't show up on spreadsheets, It shows up a little too late. Cultural strategy is one of the most important things when you're expanding, and it's not something sentimental.
Yeah. How do companies bridge that? I mean, because, one of the things I've said to a lot of my clients is, listen, you shouldn't be going in anywhere where you don't have some sort of local partnership. And I don't mean like that could be a joint venture, a strategic alliance and things like that. But it also means like if you're buying a company or whatever, like you're not going to just, in fact, I mean, you can do what you want, right? But it's not going to be successful if you're just going to bring your management system and maybe even your managers you send down there who come from a different culture, right? At first, having that local buy-in and partnership, whether that's the local management team or that's truly a partner if you're doing some sort of joint venture, strategic alliance, is crucial. And for me, I get to point that out and say that to clients, but I'm not the one who helps them figure that out and implement it and figure out how it's actually done. I mean, it's great for me to say, and it's true, right? But how you actually do that. So what have you seen? Like, let's say it is in an acquisition situation. What have you seen the firms that have done it right done in terms of their relationship with local management and combining, their systems and, and communications and things like that?
Well, at the foundation, I would say diagnose before you deploy capital. That's my number one thing. Map these decision-making norms, these hierarchy expectations, communication styles, conflict resolution or tolerance, regulatory behavior before entering the market. I cannot stress this enough, how important it is, because these problems don't appear until after you already signed the deal, right? So you align those authority structures early, right? And then you redesign your leadership behavior for that region. Don't copy paste US leadership style. It won't work, right? In stock, I would say, and this is very, very unpopular opinion that I'm going to say, right? Install compliance as a behavior, not a policy. Very different than here because it's way more flexible in most of these countries in Latin America. So if you go in installing these compliance policies right away and leaders don't model that discipline visibility that they have across borders, that's another way that I see the friction all the time.
Yeah. Yeah. And then I guess, it's even true, like you pointed this out earlier, it's very true, that folks from other places tend to think, like, oh, well, all right, maybe we figured it out in Mexico, so now we're going to do that in Brazil, right? Or in Chile or whatever, right? So it's not even like every single country, every particular geography, you got to figure it out anew because it can be very different, right?
I mean, yeah. And then what I say to most of my clients now, culture is not a soft risk. It is an absolute multiplier. It could go either one way or the other, right? So if it's aligned, your growth accelerates because you get a lot of loyalty, a lot of people that buy in quickly, and you have people that stick around, right? But if it's misaligned, it burns capital very fast, Corey.
Yeah. Talk us a little bit about, the size of companies you work with, because, there is this perception that because of maybe part of all these challenges and issues or whatever, that, you have to be huge. And obviously, bigger companies are more likely to do cross-border transactions. But in my experience, there are, nowadays, even with the internet, you could do stuff online. But especially if you're doing a deal where you do have a local presence, whether that's manufacturing, whether that's distribution, whether that's retail, whether that's, we're not talking about. I have seen, it's not just the mega companies that can do cross-border deals, right? So what size companies are you generally, what's the range that you generally work with?
I was definitely mid-level to larger corporations, but I am now branching into helping smaller businesses because it is possible. Smaller businesses think that because they're not the Coca-Colas of the Amazons of the world that they can expand, and that's not the reality. What you do have to do is a clean framework for that expansion because those larger corporations can afford those mistakes, right?
Yeah.
So as long as you have that clean framework, you stabilize your revenue first here, mainland, right? And you document your operating model very well, and you expand in layers and not in leaps like a larger corporation will do.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great advice. It's interesting because I think more and more people are becoming open to it because, even just, and this is obviously not the kind of transaction we're talking about, but just the fact that a lot more people are just using offshore folks, just even in administrative positions, things like that. Let's take a break from the show for a minute so I can tell you about an incredible resource my team and I have put together for you. Secrets of Deal-Driven Growth, Creative Ways to Grow Your Business Even in Challenging Times, is a powerful ebook that helps you take DealQuest podcast episodes and apply them to your own life and business. This is the ideal tool for anyone looking for creative ways to grow as deal makers, and you can get yours now. It's as easy as heading to coreycupfer.com/workbook and downloading your copy. While you're there, you can also consider joining our dynamic deal-driven community of founders, experts, small business owners, and entrepreneurs. Now back to the show. Like it starts opening up their mind, like, oh, wait, I've got a VA in Honduras, or, I'm using somebody in the Philippines, we got 8 people in the Philippines that are doing this, or, certainly the tech world, they have, a lot of people who do programming or in call centers or customer service or whatever. So, I think that just even that ability to have offshore talent opens up people's minds to the international market and maybe, earlier and smaller. And maybe they start saying, oh, wait a second, this is working for us. Maybe we have an opportunity to do a transaction. And certainly with labor costs in most of these places being lower than in the U.S., right? There is an arbitrage there that people can take advantage of.
I mean, yeah, definitely. If you want just to test the market, right, there's ways with no entity setup, fast market entry, you would use an EOR, an employer of record.
Yeah.
But that's definitely not something sustainable, and that's not something that I recommend long term, especially if you want to expand into that business. It becomes significantly expensive very quickly.
Yes.
So you want to use it only as a testing ground and maybe reduce early stage legal friction if you use an EOR as you grow and learn into that market. I would definitely say that it's not something sustainable, but it can be done.
Yeah. I think that's right. I mean, you're going to make your first foray just to hire somebody, let's say in an admin role, it may not, often doesn't make sense to figure out the whole legal landscape. Even how, I see, I'm in these entrepreneurial organizations a lot of times in the WhatsApp groups or the, whatever, group, platform they use. There's these questions like, oh, I have an opportunity to hire somebody, here or to do something here. How do I pay them? Right. Like that simple. And then, how do I make sure that I'm in compliance? That's where, these, the employer record, at least in the beginning could make a lot of sense because you have no idea what you're doing. And they do, but but yeah, I can definitely see what you're saying. I've heard that, before that it's not, if you can have any kind of growth over time and, it doesn't make sense to maintain that relationship at some point. You're going to want to go.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes the complexity of the exit is a little difficult, when you use an EOR, but you can, but you don't. What you don't lose with EORs is that misclassification risk of wrongful hires, right? Local labor laws. That ignorance becomes exposure later. So you still have to go through the correct, I guess, sequence of events when you're looking to expand, and also using an EOR for too long creates that cultural distance. So I go back to culture. You're not developing your understanding of that culture before going in. So it has its risks and benefits. I would just say don't stay in that format too long. You have to have some sort of scaling plan.
Yeah. Let me hit another area, which is, we don't have to spend a lot of time on it, but it is practically interesting because I've run into it with clients, and that is the stuff that's, let's say, outside the legal and regulatory, like the practical things on the ground. I mean, listen, I grew up in Brooklyn, New York, at a time when the mob was more prevalent, right, in New York. And when, people I knew, at that time, I was young, it was their parents' when they opened retail stores, one of the things you had to know was that somebody was going to come by, this was in New York back in the 60s, and look for a piece every week or every month, of what you pay. And if you didn't realize that, you were in trouble, and there weren't a lot of legal remedies for that practically, right? And certainly, so I don't want to make it seem like it never happened and still is maybe have someplace in the U.S. But there are other places, whether it is, gangs or cartels, whether it is bribery, to local officials that is expected in some of these places. And of course, it's illegal for U.S. companies to pay bribes, to foreign officials. Whether it's, I go back many years ago, but we had a situation I might have mentioned on this podcast before, where I had a client that was doing a deal back then with a Filipino company. And we get into a room, we're negotiating a deal, and there's somebody sitting there. I don't know who they are, right, what their role is. I thought they were with the other side of the table with the Philippine group. My guy was a U.S. guy. I determined at some point that this is the minister, the government minister, who has to approve this transaction, and they're openly talking about his piece of the deal. And I pull my client out of there, right? I say, Jerry, you can't do this. There's the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, and you can't properly pay a government official. And I don't know if it's true anymore, this was years ago, what was fascinating about back then was there were other countries, like Germany was one of them, where they had laws against bribing their own officials, but they actually had no law against paying money to officials in other countries. And they even, if I remember right, you were able to take a tax deduction for it as a business expense, which obviously made, it tough to compete for. So, talk to me a little bit about, you don't have to give me obviously specifics, but like, I'm assuming that kind of stuff is part of the local knowledge in some of these places, whether it's the government end, whether it's, criminal end, that companies need to be aware of, right?
You have a lot of bureaucracy in these countries, and it does exist, and sometimes it's even normal, right? And it doesn't, when you have strict compliance policies in your U.S. company, it's hard to translate that to some of these countries. But it's not really about corruption, it's about exposure, I would say, Corey. You have to protect yourself early, and you have to, even if you hire a local intermediary, make sure that you do the due diligence on that third party as well. As long as you are careful and you run and you don't rush it. I think that's where the problem is. A lot of people, they get the capital approved, and we're going to this so-and-so country, and that's it. And you just start deploying capital into that country. You're not doing the extra due diligence that's required in Latin America to avoid things like this. So I think most of the times it's not really that we have to worry about the corruption, is we have to worry about how to slow down and really do our real due diligence. And it's extra than over here. So over here you're thinking, oh, my due diligence is done. No, in Latin America is double. So you have to do due diligence on the due diligence. You understand?
Yeah.
I think what you have to avoid is rushing any deals. And you install these anti-bribery policies early, translated, signed, and enforced early. And you separate authority from local intermediaries like early in the deal, and you avoid these type of escalations, and you run those audit early. Small payments can escalate into something very ugly for you later, even small payments that you do to the wrong company.
Yeah.
So I think as long as you slow down and really dig deep on who you're using on these third parties, on these vendors and stuff, you're okay. You'll be okay. It's not as bad as people make it seem.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's doable. Because you're right. The diligence on the third parties, I've seen this before where, you have some sort of intermediary, you think that's a good thing because they're local, they have local knowledge, that's why you brought them in, but you don't know what they're doing behind the scenes on your behalf, right? To get approvals and to get things done or whatever. And that's where some companies run themselves into trouble, right? They may not have direct knowledge. And frankly, some of them may say, I don't want to know, right? And then, it's this intermediary that is doing things, but they're doing it on behalf of the company, and the company could have exposure.
And that's where I come in. I try to avoid the third parties, right? I have people that I've already done due diligence on. I have boots on the ground in all these countries just to avoid that for our clients. So we have very powerful team of finance, HR, legal, operations in all of these countries just to avoid some of those pitfalls and feeling unlucky after you get into very big trouble in that country, right?
Well, Stephanie, that's
We don't like to leave anyone exposed, I think is
yeah, that's a huge benefit. I mean, folks, like, you don't want to underestimate this, because you can trip up because of ignorance. You could trip up because, unintentionally, you get into a situation where somebody is corrupt, or somebody is, doing something improper locally on your behalf, and you don't know it. There's a lot of ways you can do it. So to have trusted resources that have experience and boots on the ground is unbelievably crucial, especially in these international deals, and in certain countries even more so than others. So tell us a little bit about, I mean, it's interesting in these times, in that, for many, many years it was just accepted that we're globalization, that inherently there's going to be expansion into global markets. It's just the way the world is going. The internet makes everything accessible. People, can communicate more easily. Then, of course, we had the pandemic, which created some folks to say, oh, well, maybe we're exposed with these supply chains that are elsewhere, and we should be onshoring more, or at least, having backups. Then there's politics, which we don't have to get into the details of, but, it's, America first, whatever. Like, the point is, there are some forces, whether it's the pandemic, supply chain issues, or political or other, views that are pushing against, trying to counteract maybe this automatic move to globalization. What are your thoughts in terms of, how those things are trending? Are you seeing in this day and age still, an increase in cross-border business, or has there been a pullback?
I think it's unavoidable. And if anyone who's out there thinks that it's slowing down, they're absolutely wrong. Now we're even seeing more smaller businesses expand. Now it's getting information is out there. How to hire someone, how to get someone to work for you in this country, how to sell your sneakers in Chile or whatever there's a lot of information out there. It's not always correct, but it's definitely way more accessible. And whoever thinks that globalization it's slowing down, they're absolutely wrong. I think most companies, if you want to stay ahead of the trend, if you want to always continue to grow, expansion should be, if you're ready, expansion should be your next thought, and globalization into whatever industry you're in, into the best market for you. You should be looking into that now.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not surprised at that answer. That's my experience. I mean, I think it's a train that's going to continue going down the tracks. Maybe there'll be some pockets or some times where there's resistance to that or whatever. But yeah, I mean, there's no way that's not going to continue.
Even the supply chains are diversifying at immense rates. I see it in the ports. I hear about it at the ports with my relationships that I have there, and companies are all reassessing, geopolitical exposure at this point.
Yeah, yeah. So now, you've said this a few times, and you just said it again a couple of minutes ago. International expansion, if you're ready, right? And you alluded to a couple of things, right? Having solid revenue, stateside, having, good systems, things like that. Let's delve a little bit more into this conversation of if you're ready. What are the factors to determine whether you're ready or you're not ready?
Well, with that, I say globalization is not going anywhere, right?
Yep.
So it's first about knowing where you can operate sustainably and structurally without creating any hidden risk for your company.
Yes.
But I would say, how strong are your financials? How strong is your operating system? How strong is your compliance? How ready is your leadership team? Some leadership teams are not ready, and you can have everything else ready, but if your leadership team is not ready to deploy, the deal won't be successful.
Let me drill down on that piece, right? Because let's talk about leadership teams being ready and not ready. Is that a matter of, like, how robust the team is? Is it a mindset thing? Is it what is it that gets leadership ready?
I would say for the most part is the maturity of your leadership team,
Yes.
the experience of your leadership team, and the cultural awareness of where they're entering.
Yep.
Most executive teams are trained in an era of predictable markets, right?
Yeah.
Clear regulatory environments, centralized operations, domestic growth, but they're not completely ready for that political volatility in these countries, how AI is accelerating everything so quickly with these cross-border operations and the complexities of cross-border workforce. They're not exposed to it. So I think if you really want your leadership team to be ready for expansion, you have to dot all your T's and cross all your I's first and prepare them and train them first to be able to make these changes,
Yeah. Let's talk about a little bit in some of these countries, right? Because also, obviously, a number of these countries are actually looking to actively encourage, multinational or cross-border, transactions to help their economies, to help sell goods, to help, employment, all that kind of stuff. And, one of the challenges, some of the challenges that I'm aware of that have been in the past is, in some places there's been issues with corruption. In some places there's been issue with political instability. In some places, there's been issue with lack of reliable legal, framework and system for redress. If somebody didn't pay you, can you go to court and try to collect, your money and that kind of stuff, right? So, talk to me a little bit about what you're seeing in terms of the evolution in some of these, markets, legal, political systems to become more attractive for international investment.
I think they're developing very fast. Most of these markets have a lot of talent that you'll be surprised. So we see it as, oh, we got cheap labor. And I see it as, this is leverage to put me on the map on a different level, to grow my company, to tap into this amazing talent. So I think every country has a specific niche, I would say, or multiple niches.
Yeah.
So that's why I would say run the audit first, see exactly what market you should go into. Because based on resources, talent pool, industry trends, you want to make sure that you're choosing what's right for your industry and market. But we do have this availability now that we didn't have before, which is tapping into this really, really amazing talent that you have near shore, right? Because we're the same time zone.
Time zones, yeah, which is a big thing, like I even with back office and executive and bookkeeping, financial, whatever. A lot of folks would more often using folks like in the Philippines or in Asia or in India. A lot of them would work U.S. hours, but still, I think I've seen more of a move to consistent time zone folks in certainly over the last 5 years.
Yeah. And it's definitely available. You just want to make sure, like, I will give you an example, or anything else I will hold as a secret. But you have, let's say, if you want to tap into data centers, then you should be in Brazil or Chile or even Mexico. If you want to tap into back of office help, I would say the Caribbean. There's very specific talents in every specific region of Latin America.
Yeah.
It's just
that's great. And that's something you certainly help people determine, right? Which are the best places. So that's great.
Listen, if you tell me you want to sell bobby pins in Brazil and I'm telling you it's better in Colombia and you still say I want to go to Brazil, we'll figure out a way.
Right.
Customer knows best.
Yeah.
But yeah, I do give you the right info. I give you to the best of my knowledge with the team boots on the ground that I have. I give you the most competent information for your industry.
Great. What else about your specific services and company we covered? We hit a lot of it in just talking generally. But give us a little more comprehensive view of all the things you do for your clients.
I audit the company. If you want to either scale or even reinforce your operation, I audit. I give you the cracks that you have in your operation, and then we either fix it or I print out a nice little report for you to show your investors.
Yeah.
And then if you're ready to expand to Latin America, that's a whole different arm of my company, right? So that's a whole different extension of my company. That goes through rigorous governance model that I created because you want to make sure this is not cheap, right? So you want to make sure that your capital is protected. So we give you an airtight investor model report to be able to really highlight that you are ready. And if you're not ready, we'll go back to the drawing board. I tell you what you have to fix in your operation before going to your PEs or VCs of the world.
Yeah. And then when they're ready to go, obviously you have the local connections. You're going to help them, with all the local knowledge, everything else we talked about, their operating systems down there, their employee and cultural, all that kind of stuff that we discussed, right?
Yeah. Once we decide where we're going to enter, I tap into my team boots on the ground in each country. So it's either if it's in Brazil, I have HR, finance, legal. operations. I have that in most of the countries. That's Chile, Argentina, Dominican Republic, Costa Rica. So depends where you want to go. Once the deal is done, once you have decided, we start building that foundation for you to cross that border. No pun intended.
Yeah, exactly. So, Stephanie, if people want to find out more about all these phenomenal services that you provide, where do they go?
LumenaGlobal.com, or they can find me on LinkedIn. In all socials. I'm on all social platforms as Lumena Global.
Excellent. So, Stephanie, my final question on the podcast is always about my highest value in life, which is freedom. And for me, that means freedom from oppression for people around the world to everything from that to why I've been an entrepreneur for decades and haven't had a boss. What does freedom mean to you, and how does it impact your life and business?
Freedom to me, I think freedom to me would be to finally have that, what I have really much fought for all my life is the real seat at the table. It's what I call it. I started in leadership at a very early stage of my career, and I noticed really quickly how that seat sometimes is fake. You look good for the checkbox, but not necessarily give you the opportunity to share your talents and speak up. So I think for me, freedom is to feel that value come. And I have received it because I branched out on my own. I have finally seen this, so I know what it's like. But to have that authority in a game that's really full of males is freedom for me.
I love that. And I'll tell you, I was so impressed when we got to have, our short pre-call and just with what you've built, in your journey and what you've created and the value that you bring to folks in such an important area where there's so many ways it can go wrong, So, I appreciate what you're providing and the resource you are to our listeners and, and definitely some of our clients in the future. So it's been great to have you on. Thanks for being such a great guest on the DealQuest podcast.
Thank you, Corey.
Thank you for joining me on this episode of DealQuest, where we help you understand how deal-driven growth can be your ticket to freedom. If you are interested in finding out more about my law firm, the services we provide to entrepreneurial and growing companies across industries all over the country, and my partner Brian Megan and I, and my amazing team, just head over to kupferlaw.com. That's kupferlaw.com. And if you want to follow more of my content, head over to my LinkedIn page where I post regularly. I'm Corey Kupfer. Until next week, wishing you the freedom and financial prosperity that I know your DealQuest will bring.